be verified. It is supposed to be. It is supposed to be vetted in every way. So in the days to come, this is obviously going to be a big issue. With the latest on that, Sarah Carter is standing by. Sarah, what do you have on that?
Well, certainly the scathing report by Inspector General Horowitz today on McCabe, I think, was so telling. It not only verified the reasons why OPR, the Office of Professional Responsibility, Sean, with the FBI, fired McCabe, and that this wasn't a move by President Trump, even if he wanted him fired. It was a move by the FBI because what we saw was the detailed interviews, even with Comey, about McCabe and the reasons why he lied. I mean, look, he lied directly to the FBI director. He lied to the Inspector General and his investigators. He lied under oath. And then he tried to throw two of his own FBI executives under the bus and basically tried to blame them for leaking, even reprimanded them in a phone call, apparently, even though he had originally authorized the leak. And now with Comey, we're seeing the same kind of issues coming up.
Yeah, we look at these images, and I know we'll have a lot to say about James Comey and this whole dossier and the presentation of the FISA court. Those images on the right side of your screen, literally, showing the horror of these chemical weapons attacks against innocent men, women, and children. Hang on, Sarah. We'll get back to you in a second, but we have new breaking information. Our own Jennifer Griffin is at the Pentagon. Jennifer.
Well, Sean, those images you see taking off from the British air base in Cyprus, those are British Tornado fighter jets. They are taking off as we speak. That's a live feed that we are getting from that base. But as we just reported, the B-1 bombers, the U.S. Air Force B-1 bombers, those are supersonic bombers that fly from a base in Qatar. They were involved in the airstrikes tonight over Syria. They likely would have been escorted by F-22 fighter jets because I misspoke earlier. The B-1 is not stealth, and so they would have had to have been escorted. The F-22 would have been the most likely escort in case they were challenged by any Syrian or Russian aircraft. But those B-1 bombers are interesting because they can fire standoff missiles from up to 600 miles away. They're known as JASSM missiles. They are anywhere from 200 to 600 miles out. Those standoff missiles can strike a target. So those B-1s are extremely lethal, and they would be joining those Tomahawk missiles being fired from the Navy's USS Donald Cook that's in the eastern Mediterranean. Those Tomahawks, of course, can fly up to 1,500 miles. They fly at a rate, the Tomahawk flies at a rate of 550 miles per hour. They're low, they're radar evading, and it's like if you were to look up, it would be like seeing a flying telephone going past. But those Tomahawks are now joined, we're told, by B-1 bombers from the U.S. Air Force. Sean.
All right, Jennifer Griffin, stand by. Your description, by the way, the absolute might and power of our military is awe-inspiring. These people are incredible. Mike Tobin has more information from Jerusalem, just breaking now. Mike?
Well, we've got a lot of information that the Syrian air defenses did engage as the strike was beginning. Specifically now we have from Syrian state TV reports or a claim by them that they shot down some 13 Tomahawk missiles. Again, what we've heard from people on the ground there, at least a lot of it through Arab TV that I'm getting now, is that this first wave anyway was rather brief. But the development that I have right now is a claim through Syrian state TV that 13 Tomahawk missiles were shot down, and multiple reports that the Syrian air defenses did engage at the beginning of this strike.
About the capability that you know of, Mike? In other words,
it's hard. Go ahead.
No. What would be? Do they have the capability to take these out of the air? And if so, is that Syria doing that? Or remember, there was a threat from Moscow that they would try to take the missiles out of the air.
I can't really hazard a guess, certainly about cooperation with Russia in terms of activating their air defenses. I've been in and out of Syria a few times, and their stuff does look dramatically antiquated, certainly compared to the modern resources that the United States military has. So you can kind of guess that it's a stretch, and the precision that would be required to intercept an incoming Tomahawk missile. But all I can give you right now is the report from State TV, their claim that they intercepted some 13 Tomahawks.
No, okay, we'll find out more about that. We also have one thing to remind our viewers on this night as this now is underway even as we speak here. But John Kerry said 100% of these weapons are gone, as did Russia. The assurances came often. Here from the White House right now, we check in with our own John Roberts. He has some news as well. John, what's going on there tonight?
Good evening to you, Sean. We were told just a short time ago by a White House official that the president made the decision about whether to use military force against Syria a while ago. And that probably would have been toward the beginning of this week. The question was not if we were going to take military action, it's what sort of military action we would take. The president met with his national security team several times over the course of the last few days to listen to the plans, the options, varying degrees of response. And the president picked the one that he wanted, he thought would be the most effective. And that's what we're seeing going on tonight. But it wasn't a matter of the president deliberating over whether we should or whether we shouldn't. I asked him in the cabinet room on Wednesday if it was inevitable. He said, well, we're going to meet about it and we'll see. But it looked like by that time, Sean, the president had already made up his mind. Then it was just a matter of hearing from the Pentagon about what targets they thought would be the most effective. And then the order went down to put everything into place. I got to say, the White House did a pretty good job of playing its cards very close to its vest. There was a lot of kabuki theater that was going on all day today and into the night, with a lot of head fakes going on. But when the pool got called, even when the pool got called into the diplomatic room, we were being told that the president and the first lady were going to the Trump International Hotel for dinner. But we kind of got the idea pretty quickly that that wasn't what was going to happen. But you know, we're in the clear light of day. Tomorrow we'll find out what the bomb damage assessment was here. We're not expected to hear from the White House until sometime tomorrow morning. So we'll see what they have to say. But in the next few minutes, Sean, we will be hearing from briefers at the Pentagon about what the targets were and the assets that were used.
John, do you have any obviously it was deliberative, it was well thought out. You're right, they didn't show their hand. That was a major campaign promise of the president. But in the meantime, too, while independently Great Britain and France had said that they, too, had their own red line in the sand, this coalition was put together without a lot of fanfare.
It was, and it was really interesting to see the degree of forcefulness with which both French President Macron and the UK Prime Minister Theresa May came out here. Theresa May in her statement tonight saying that there is no practicable alternative to the use of force to degrade and deter the use of chemical weapons by the Syrian regime, as you see them getting ready for the briefing there at the Pentagon. And she went on to say, this was deep into her statement, this is not about intervening in a civil war. It is not about regime change. So clearly they weren't trying to cut off the head of the Assad regime. She said it's about a limited and targeted strike that does not further escalate tensions in the region and does everything possible to prevent civilian casualties. So limited and targeted strike. I think those are two key words that we should take a look at here, Sean, as we watch what's unfolding there with the jets taking off from Cyprus and when we begin to get those initial bomb damage assessments, because it is just about daybreak there in Syria. The sun should be starting to break through about an hour's time.
You know, all right, John Roberts at the White House tonight. The president, if you're just joining us, has ordered strikes against Syria tonight in the wake of the chemical weapons attack against innocent men, women, and children. It was a coalition of the willing, including France and the Brits. The president saying that these are precision, targeted attacks. President going through the heart-wrenching videos that the world saw of men, women, children, infants, victims of these vicious, horrible, terrible weapons. I want to give a shout out. We wish our military forces much success. They're in our prayers, they're in our thoughts tonight. We're awaiting a Pentagon press briefing on the coalition attacks in Syria. Stay with the Fox News channel for continuing live breaking news coverage as we pick it up. The Pentagon now will have that press conference in mere moments. Thanks for being with us.
This is a Fox News alert. In the last hour, President Trump announced that the United States has launched what he called targeted strikes into Syria. This launch in retaliation for Assad regime's apparent use of chemical weapons against civilians. It was conducted along with France and Great Britain. And at this moment, we're awaiting a news conference at the Pentagon where we're told that military officials will lay out the specifics of these strikes. And while we wait for that, let's bring in Fox News national security correspondent Jennifer Griffin, who's standing by at the Pentagon, has been monitoring Mattis is speaking now. Okay, General Mattis is just stepping up. We'll go to that live.
Decided to again defy the norms of civilized people, showing callous disregard for international law by using chemical weapons to murder women, children, and other innocents. We and our allies find these atrocities inexcusable. As our Commander-in-Chief, the President has the authority under Article 2 of the Constitution to use military force overseas to defend important United States national interests. The United States has vital national interest in averting a worsening catastrophe in Syria and specifically deterring the use and proliferation of chemical weapons. Last year, in response to a chemical weapons attack against civilians and to signal the regime to cease chemical weapons use, we targeted the military base from which the weapons were delivered. Earlier today, President Trump directed the U.S. military to conduct operations in consonance with our allies to destroy the Syrian regime's chemical weapons research, development, and production capabilities. Tonight, France, the United Kingdom, and the United States took decisive action to strike the Syrian chemical weapons infrastructure. Clearly, the Assad regime did not get the message last year. This time, our allies and we have struck harder. Together, we have sent a clear message to Assad and his murderous lieutenants that they should not perpetrate another chemical weapons attack for which they will be held accountable. The 70 nations in the Defeat ISIS coalition remain committed to defeating ISIS in Syria. The strike tonight separately demonstrates international resolve to prevent chemical weapons from being used on anyone under any circumstance in contravention of international law. I want to emphasize that these strikes are directed at the Syrian regime. In conducting these strikes, we have gone to great lengths to avoid civilian and foreign casualties. But it is a time for all civilized nations to urgently unite in ending the Syrian civil war by supporting the United Nations-backed Geneva peace process. In accordance with the Chemical Weapons Convention prohibiting the use of such weapons, we urge responsible nations to condemn the Assad regime and to join us in our firm resolve to prevent chemical weapons from being used again. General Dunford will provide a military update.
Good evening. I'm joined by our French attaché, Brigadier General Montague, and our British attaché, Air Vice Marshal Gavin Parker. Secretary Mattis has just outlined the policy and legal framework for tonight's strike in Syria. I'll address the strike from the military dimension. At 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, French, British, and U.S. forces struck targets in Syria in support of President Trump's objective to deter the future use of chemical weapons. Our forces were integrated throughout the planning and execution of the operation. The targets that were struck and destroyed were specifically associated with the Syrian regime's chemical weapons program. We also selected targets that would minimize the risk to innocent civilians. The first target was a scientific research center located in the greater Damascus area. This military facility was a Syrian center for the research, development, production, and testing of chemical and biological warfare technology. The second target was a chemical weapons storage facility west of Homs. We assessed that this was the primary location of Syrian sarin and precursor production equipment. The third target, which was in the vicinity of the second target, contained both a chemical weapons equipment storage facility and an important command post. U.S., British, and French naval and air forces were involved in the operation, and for reasons of operational security, I won't be more specific this evening. Before we take questions, I'd like to address how this evening's strike were qualitatively and quantitatively different than 2017. Last year, we conducted a unilateral strike on a single site. The focus was on the aircraft associated with the Syrian chemical weapons attack in April of 2017. This evening, we conducted strikes with two allies on multiple sites that will result in a long-term degradation of Syria's capability to research, develop, and employ chemical and biological weapons. Important infrastructure was destroyed, which will result in a setback for the Syrian regime. They will lose years of research and development data, specialized equipment, and expensive chemical weapons precursors. The strike was not only a strong message to the regime that their actions were inexcusable, but it also inflicted maximum damage without unnecessary risk to innocent civilians. And with that, the Secretary and I would be glad to take your questions.
Mr. Secretary, first of all, did the U.S. suffer any losses initially? And more broadly, could you, the President in his remarks said that the U.S. and its allies are prepared to sustain this operation until the Syrians stop using chemical weapons. Does this mean that the U.S. and its partners will continue military operations beyond this initial operation tonight?
That will depend on Mr. Assad should he decide to use more chemical weapons in the future. And, of course, the powers that have signed the chemical weapons prohibition have every reason to challenge Assad should he choose to violate that. But right now, this is a one-time shot, and I believe that it sent a very strong message to dissuade him, to deter him from doing this again.
The U.S. lost.
We'll brief on that in the morning. We want to give you a full brief in the morning. Right now, we have no reports of losses.
Thank you.
Secretary Mattis, Chairman Dunford, thank you for doing that. Have you seen any retaliation from the Russians or the Iranians? And how long do you think this operation could last? Is it a matter of hours or days, or could go longer than that?
Yeah, we did have some initial surface-to-air missile activity from the Syrian regime. That's the only retaliatory action that we're aware of at this time. And the nature of the operation, we've completed the targets that were assigned to the United States Central Command. Those operations are complete.
General Dunford and also Secretary Mattis, could you talk a little bit more about your concerns that you've expressed earlier in the week about Russian escalation? General Dunford, were you able to talk to your Russian counterpart, General Gerasimov? What are your concerns about escalation? And if we're permitted to ask your British counterpart a question, I would like to know the sense of your government about whether the situation with the Skripals and the Russian involvement in that, how that Russian involvement played a role in your decision to enter this coalition this evening.
Barbara, let me address the last point first. Our attachés were kind enough to join us this evening. They're not going to get out in front of their president and prime minister, respectively, so that the national messages will be provided from their capitals here very soon. But with regard to the Russian concerns, we specifically identified these targets to mitigate the risk of Russian forces being involved, and we used our normal deconfliction channels. Those were active this week to work through the airspace issues and so forth. We did not do any coordination with the Russians on the strikes, nor did we pre-notify them.
Mr. Secretary, it was just a couple of days ago that you said you're still assessing the intelligence on the chemical weapons attack, suspected attack. So at this point, do you know what the chemical was used in that attack? Was it sarin? Was it chlorine? And also, what is your evidence it was actually delivered by the Syrian regime?
Say the last part again, Tom.
What's your evidence it was delivered by the Syrian regime? Are you quite clear it was?
I am confident the Syrian regime conducted a chemical attack on innocent people in this last week. Yes, absolutely confident of it. And we have the intelligence level of confidence that we needed to conduct the attack.
As far as the actual chemical used, do you know what it was? Was it nerve agent? Was it chlorine? Do you have a sense of what it was?
We are very much aware of one of the agents. There may have been more than one agent used. We are not clear on that yet. We know at least one chemical agent was used.
I just want to clarify on the deconfliction line. You notified the Russians ahead of time before the operation began what you were going to do and what targets you were going to strike?
Gordon, to be clear, the only communications that took place specifically associated with this operation before the targets were struck was the normal deconfliction of the airspace, the procedures that are in place for all of our operations in Syria.
General Dunford, you mentioned that the the Syrian air defenses had engaged. The Syrian state TV is saying they shot down 13 Tomahawk missiles. Can you refute that?
Jennifer, I can't tell you the results. We literally, as you know, the time on target was about an hour ago, and we came straight up here to give you the best information we have right now. Tomorrow morning, as the Secretary will talk about in a minute, we'll give you the more detailed operational update and some of the details, but those details aren't available to us right now.
This wave of airstrikes is over.
This wave of airstrikes is over. That's why we're out here speaking to you now.
Secretary Mattis, I just wanted to follow up on what you said about the legal basis for this strike. Could you talk a little bit more about that? Because in your testimony the other day, it sounded like you were saying that this a potential strike would somehow be linked to self-defense and the presence of American forces in Syria. Can you say a little bit more about that? And also, regarding whether or not there will be future action or additional strikes, you said that it would depend on whether or not the Assad government conducts future chemical attacks, but can you explain a little bit more about what would be the threshold for that? Because there were repeated chemical attacks between the April 2017 attack and today, and would you consider a small-scale chlorine attack sufficient to launch additional strikes?
Right now, I will just tell you we're in close consultation with our allies. We review all the evidence all the time. It is difficult, as you know, to get evidence out of Syria, but right now we have no additional attacks planned. But as far as the legal authority under the Article 2 of the Constitution, we believe the President has every reason to defend vital American interests, and that is what he did here tonight under that authority.
Hey, sir, a couple questions for General Dunford. What were some of the targeting considerations or difficulties involved with going after chemical facilities? How long did the operation take to plan? And for Secretary Mattis, last year's strikes were described as proportional, moderate. How would you describe this year's in contrast to that?
Yeah, Tony, we chose these particular targets to mitigate the risk of civilian casualties, number one. We chose these targets because they were specifically associated with the chemical program, the Syrian chemical program. And obviously, when we take a look at target planning and so forth, we look at the location relative to other populated areas, collateral damage, proportionality. So these targets were carefully selected with proportionality, discrimination, and being specifically associated with the chemical program.
All standoff weapons or any manned aircraft?
There were manned aircraft involved. I won't give you any of the details operationally until tomorrow morning, but we will do that at that time.
Sir, instead of proportional last year,
a question to Secretary Mattis. So up until yesterday, and I'm going to quote you here, you said, "I cannot tell you that we have evidence." So when did you become confident that a chemical attack happened? And the second one...
Yeah, yesterday.
Yesterday, after you said that.
Yes.
And then second, you talked about targeting the chemical weapons infrastructure of al-Assad. If there were actually any chemical weapons or agents in those facilities that you targeted, I assume they would create health hazard in the region or not?
Yeah, we don't believe. We did very close analysis. As the chairman pointed out, we did everything we could in our intelligence assessment and our planning to minimize to the maximum degree possible any chance of civilian casualties. We are very much aware this is difficult to do in a situation like this, especially when the poison gas that Assad assured the world he had gotten rid of obviously still exists. So it is a challenging problem set, and we had the right military officers dealing with it.
So you can confirm there's going to be no leak into the air? Or
of course not. We'll do our best.
When the surface-to-air defenses engaged, did they become a target, and did U.S. air power or other assets take out those targets?
Yeah, Tora, I'm not aware of any response that we took right now. Again, we'll gather overnight. As you can imagine, we tried to leave the United States Central Command alone here tonight. They were quite busy. We'll, through the night, gather the operational detail, and we'll be back tomorrow morning to provide that to you.
Yeah, Secretary Mattis or Chairman Dunford, last year, you changed the force protection levels for the Syrian troops that were U.S. troops that were in Syria. There are 2,000 U.S. troops in Syria. have you changed force protection levels based on potential responses from Russia?
Yeah, Hans, as you can imagine, the commander always takes prudent measures, especially in an environment that we're in tonight, so they did make adjustments.
Just to be clear on the deconfliction line, you told them that you're going to be operating in airspace, but you didn't tell them, the Russians, what the targets were?
That is absolutely correct. We used the normal deconfliction channels to deconflict the airspace that we were using. We did not coordinate targets or any planning with the Russians.
What was the response, sir?
That information was passed at the operational link from the Combined Air Operations Center in Qatar, so I wasn't on the line. But that kind of information, just to put it in perspective, is passed routinely every day and every night. So they may not have found anything unusual about that particular airspace deconfliction.
Thank you so much, Katrina Manson from the Financial Times. Can you talk a little bit about any Iran targets that you initially, Iran-associated targets that you initially considered, and why you may have not gone for them? And could your colleagues explain exactly the sort of contribution that you've made to tonight's operation?
Again, our allied officers are here out of respect for the fact that they were part of the mission from planning all the way through to the political decision taken. And once their heads of state speak tomorrow, then that'll be the initial statement from those capitals. But as far as any other targets, we looked at targets specifically designed to address the chemical weapons threat that we have seen manifested. The whole world has watched in horror these weapons being used. Those were the only targets that we were examining for prosecution.
Secretary General Dunford, you mentioned 3 target areas that were struck. How can you be sure that from now on these are all of the target areas or all of the involved production facilities for chemical weapons that the Syrians are using? And do you believe that there are additional locations where they are producing such materials?
This is a great question. We had a number of targets to select from. And again, we did not select those that had a high risk of collateral damage and specifically a high risk of civilian casualties. And so the weaponeering, back to the earlier question, the weaponeering was done, the modeling was done to make sure that we mitigated the risk of any chemicals that were in those facilities and mitigate the risk of civilian casualties. So were there other targets that we looked at? There were. We selected these specific targets both based on the significance to the chemical weapons program as well as the location and the layout.
Thanks. Secretary Mattis, it seems like this strike tonight was pretty limited, not too dissimilar from last year. I know it was three targets this time instead of 1, but it still seems a little bit more targeted and more specific than I think a lot of chemical weapons again.
Nothing is certain in these kinds of matters. However, we used a little over double the number of weapons this year than we used last year. It was done on targets that we believed were selective to hurt the chemical weapons program. We confined it to the chemical weapons type targets. We were not out to expand this. We were very precise and proportionate, but at the same time, it was a heavy strike.
Mr. Secretary, prior to the attack, how important was it to get the support from the allies, not only from an intelligence point of view, but also just from the countries themselves?
It's always important that we act internationally in a unified way over something, especially that is such an atrocity as this that we've observed going on in Syria. But I would also tell you that these allies, the Americans, the French, the British, we have operated together through thick and thin, through good times and bad. And this is a very, very well integrated team. Wherever we operate, we do so with complete trust in each other, the professionalism, but more than that, the belief that one another will be there when the chips are down. So it's important, and it's a statement about the level of trust between our nations.
Could you just let us know whether the Syrians were able to hide a lot of these chemical weapons in the last several days, since there's been so much talk about a possible strike? Did that give the Syrians time to kind of move some of these weapons off limits? And then Secretary Mattis, just to confirm earlier when you were saying you had information about one of the chemicals, but we're all assuming that means chlorine, that you had information confirming chlorine, but not necessarily sarin. If you could just clarify that part.
Yeah, Phil, the first question, I'm not aware of any specific actions that the Syrians took to move chemical weapons in the last couple of days.
Yeah, we're very confident that chlorine was used. We are not ruling out sarin right now.
General, I'd like to follow up on Lewis's question about the targets that you first examined and then triaged down to the 3 tonight. It sounds like you went after facilities and not the actual weapons, as indicated earlier, to minimize accidental risk to civilians. In the targets that remain, could you characterize perhaps the ability for Syria to ramp up again and again have chemical weapons?
Yeah, I think it's too early to make that assessment. It's too early to make that assessment right now.
Thank you. General Dunford, did any Russian defenses engage U.S., British, or French ships or missiles? And Secretary Mattis, were any of the strikes tonight intended to kill Bashar al-Assad?
The only reaction that I'm aware of at this time was Syrian surface-to-air missiles. I happen to be down in the National Military Command Center and was aware of that activity. I'm not aware of any Russian activity, and I'm not aware of the full scope of the Syrian regime response at this time. Again, those will be details we'll pull together for you in the morning.
Yeah, the targets tonight, again, were specifically designed to degrade the Syrian war machine's ability to create chemical weapons and to set that back right now. There were no attempts to broaden or expand that target set. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming in this evening. Based on recent experience, we fully expect a significant disinformation campaign over the coming days by those who have aligned themselves with the Assad regime. And in an effort to maintain transparency and accuracy, my Assistant for Public Affairs, Ms. Dana White, and Lieutenant General McKenzie, the Director of the Joint Staff here in Washington, will provide a brief of known details tomorrow morning. We anticipate about 9 o'clock in the same location. But thank you again for coming in this evening, ladies and gentlemen.
All right, let's go now to John Roberts, who's monitoring the situation at the White House. John.
Laura, good evening to you. And the president continues to monitor the situation as the bombs either continue to fall or the missiles continue to strike or the initial bomb damage assessments are being made. And tonight, the White House releasing what they say is a call for action on Syria, calling on Syria and Syria's patrons to declare all aspects of Syria's chemical weapons program, destroy the remaining chemical weapons stockpiles and dismantle the program, and allow secure and unfettered access to the UN chemical weapons team to investigate the attack in Douma last Saturday. The White House also coming out now, not with specific intelligence, Laura, but a little more granularity in what led them to believe that there was, in fact, a chemical weapons attack in Douma last Saturday. A large volume of high-resolution, reliable photos and video from Douma that clearly document victims suffering from asphyxiation and foaming at the mouth with no signs of external wounds. Reliable intelligence that indicates Syrian military officials coordinated what appears to be the use of chlorine in Douma on April the 7th. Credible medical personnel and organizations have reported symptoms of chlorine and sarin gas. Eyewitness accounts reporting that an Mi-8 helicopter launched from a Syrian regime airfield was circling Douma at the time of the attack. Photos of barrel bombs that were dropped, and doctors and aid organizations on the ground in Douma reporting the strong smell of chlorine and described symptoms consistent with the exposure to sarin gas. The White House also sending a very sharp message to Russia tonight, saying that the Trump administration has made it clear that Russia and Iran share responsibility for the brutal actions of the Assad regime. The United States will not be fooled by another Russian disinformation campaign trying to deflect the blame Russian claims that Assad has eliminated his chemical weapons program are clearly untrue, and due to its inability or refusal to curb Assad's crimes, Russia must assume responsibility for Assad's behavior. The president did this several times in the past week. They're doing it again tonight, saying ultimately Vladimir Putin is responsible for what happened in Syria last Saturday and ultimately responsible for the American response tonight. A little bit more color of what happened this week. The president made the decision, Laura, about taking military action much earlier this week. It was then just up to his generals at the Pentagon and his national security team here at the White House to provide him with the information that he thought would best address the situation here. And you heard General Dunford and James Mattis, the Secretary of Defense, lay that plan all out. And Mike Pence, the vice president, went to Lima, Peru, on the president's behalf. The president was supposed to be in Lima today, but canceled the trip earlier this week. Pence was at a dinner for the Summit of the Americas, suddenly got up, left the table, got in the motorcade, went back to the hotel where he made secure telephone calls to the congressional leadership, Paul Ryan, Mitch McConnell, Nancy Pelosi. I'm told that he tried to reach the Senate Minority Leader, Chuck Schumer, several times, but Schumer was on a plane and could not be reached. But as soon as Schumer landed, the vice president got in touch with him to inform him of what was happening. You could also expect that the president talked with Theresa May of Britain and Emmanuel Macron of France just before this whole thing went off as well, because he does have their full support and cooperation in these strikes on Syria. Laura?
All right, John, thanks so much. And let's get reaction now from Fox News contributor Sarah Carter. She's president of Security Studies, the Security Studies Group, and Jim Hansen, military analyst, and retired Colonel Douglas McGregor. All right, guys, a lot to unpack here. Sarah, let's start with you. What is your take tonight? I mean, the goal here is to provide a strong deterrence against the production, spread, and use of chemical weapons. We tried to do that last year. Was it done successfully last year? Apparently not, but this will.
Well, this is a difficult situation because obviously Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, since he first launched chemical attacks in 2013 in Ghouta, and I remember being on the phone with doctors. Actually, I was talking to a doctor in Ghouta when the attack was launched, and I remember the horror that they were facing then. Mm-hmm. So we haven't seen it as a deterrent since then. I mean, Assad's continued to use this. But now we see three nations joining together, France, Great Britain, and the United States, sending a strong message, not just to Assad, but to Russia and Iran, into the rest of the world, as well as North Korea. Remember, proliferation is what we're really concerned about here. If we're concerned about our national security risk, then this is the reason why the president did this. He was standing on the principle that he told them, if you cross this red line with me, I have to react. And eventually he did. So we're going to have to wait and see how this unfolds, because we don't know what Russia's reaction is going to be to this. I know a lot of people are concerned, but you know what? Bullies are bullies. And when you push a bully back, most of the time they back up, but we still don't know.
Colonel McGregor.
Well, I find the whole thing perplexing. I mean, first of all, just a week after the president announces his intention to withdraw troops from Syria, suddenly the Syrian government that has effectively won the civil war is practically over, decides to launch a chemical attack. Seems very odd. Then we see sarin and chlorine gas used together. That's never happened before. That's the first in the history of chemical warfare. Doesn't make any sense. Then finally, we said, well, we didn't really inform the Russians, but we know the German press has told us over the last 24 hours of consistent back-channel reports between Washington and Moscow. So I'm quite obvious that we made the Russians aware of what was going on. They got out of the way, and we picked targets that I think, in retrospect, will turn out perhaps not to be what we thought. So I think this is another cosmetic attack that makes the morally righteous in Washington feel good, but changes nothing on the ground.
Jim, South Sudan has had a 4-year civil war that's killed tens of thousands of people. Entire villages have been burned with flamethrowers, boys and girls locked in straw huts, lit on fire. There are atrocities committed every day all over the world, including in our strategic adversary, China. And yet we go in again with a military strike a year after a previous military strike. And I guess it feels good because there are horrible things happening there. But what do we really accomplish here tonight in Syria? This was not why Donald Trump got elected, in my view.
But President Trump delivered a warning, and President Vladimir Putin, Assad, and the Iranians all ignored that warning. he delivered on the promise that he would retaliate if they did. He had to do that.
Yeah,
Otherwise,
once he delivered the warning.
Yeah, and it was the right thing to do. Yeah. We also have a strategic interest in Iran not becoming a land bridge to the Mediterranean.
Maybe we shouldn't have gone into Iraq then, because that helped them.
That's a bigger story.
Yeah.
But what President Trump did here is he delivered the correct message to the correct parties. What was blown up, it's important, but it's not the most important thing. The fact that we will deliver on our promises as the United States. And I thought, as Sarah said, I thought it was great that we put the band back together and that the U.S., the UK, and France acted in concert. That matters to the world to show that we are now a coalition of some of the strongest countries.
Absolutely, and it stops that Shia crescent from developing, and that's something else that they're very concerned about, is how Iran is moving across the Middle East.
And who started? I mean, I just go back. And how did that start? I mean, there's a lot of dominoes falling in the Middle East, and sometimes when it feels good in the moment, the Iraq War, which I was all in favor of, then all of a sudden you look at 4 years later, you're like, well, what the heck? What's ISIS? What's happening?
How we get out matters.
Yeah.
The end game in Syria matters.
I still don't know. Oh, Sebastian, you're so smart. Why does Saddam Hussein? I see, I'm having all confused. Why did Assad decide to do this now, Sebastian, given the fact that Donald Trump, his instinct is, let's get the heck out of there. We've trillions of dollars spent in the Middle East. China is on the rise. We don't want to get bogged down there. And then the attack happens. Why did that unfold that way?
Well, look, Laura, I know a lot of people are queasy tonight, but they should look. Colonel McGregor's being obnoxiously obtuse. The president needs to be listened to. This isn't about Rwanda. This isn't about Sudan. This is a battlefield where chemical weapons are on the loose with multiple actors, many of them jihadists. This is a regime that has committed mass murder. His father was a mass murderer, and so is Bashar al-Assad. The idea that this is irrelevant to America is so a-strategic, it beggars belief. The president is not an interventionist. He's not going to deploy 160,000 troops like the Bush administration did. But we have to assert our moral clarity. You do not get to use illegal chemical weapons against women and children. And I was in the White House a year ago, and I saw the intelligence. And guess what, Colonel? It was the Assad regime that did it. And when a 4-star retired Marine Corps legend, like the current Secretary of Defense, tells you that we've seen the intelligence and it was Assad, everybody should take that to the bank, and shame on you for questioning General Mattis, retired.
Well, I've met General Mattis, and I'm happy to question it because I don't think General Mattis meant what he said.
You don't have the clearances, and you haven't seen it, Colonel.
Well, you'd be surprised at the clearances that I have.
Have you seen intelligence? Have you seen intelligence?
Sebastian, will you please calm down for a second?
No, it's outrageous.
We've been down this road before. We launched cruise missiles
not with
in
this president.
1999 against
not
the
with this president.
But one at a time, Sebastian. You can respond in 1 second.
We launched it against a factory we said was building missile parts in 1999 and connected to Al-Qaeda. It was a milk production facility. We've had so much misinformation. It is absolutely not clear what happened a year ago. I completely reject that.
It is to me. You were outside the building.
It is not clear to me. Absolutely not. And I have spent my life in the military, and I have seen intelligence manipulated repeatedly over the last 25, 26 years.
I'm glad you know better than this president and his
absolutely,
Secretary of Defense.
I think that President Trump needs to listen to the 50 million Americans who voted for him. They did not vote
60,
for this,
actually.
And they didn't support this.
I'm glad you speak to all Americans, Colonel. I'm glad you've made yourself the spokesman of 60 million Americans. That's very modest of you.
Well, let's talk about the War Powers Resolution, because this always comes up every time we launch a military strike, whether Congress should give its imprimatur to the action. And it allows the president to use force on a temporary basis. Like he can do it on his own, doesn't have to go to Congress. Very limited, narrow criteria. Many say tonight that didn't meet that criteria, that this type of strike actually does require congressional approval. I understand. I can actually make the argument for both sides. I think it's an interesting discussion. Jim.
The War Powers Act has never been tested in the Supreme Court, so there's no ruling as to whether it's
Thank God. The Supreme Court gets most of the stuff wrong,
too. The Constitution, under Article 2, as General Mattis cited, gives the president authority as commander-in-chief to do what he needs to do to take care of American strategic interests worldwide, anytime, any place, anywhere. If he thinks the Syrian regime dropping chemical weapons in a theater where there are U.S. troops on the ground is important enough to bomb them, he's got every right, and he doesn't have to ask anybody.
Jim just brought up a really important point. We do have troops on the ground. We are still continuing to train. People are still losing their lives in this region, and they're fighting back against not just Assad, but Iranian IRGC on the ground. We know that they're watching the Russians. We also have intelligence assets on the ground. So when something like this happens, when we're in direct threat, and I think not just to our men and women on the ground, but also to our nation. I mean, we have to think of the national security implications of proliferation, and that's something that a lot of people are not thinking about. But we had Islamic State on the ground. We have al-Qaeda. We have various rebel groups.
Did Assad attack ISIS?
Well, we did. We did.
Did
see
Assad
that.
attack ISIS?
You mean, did Assad attack ISIS? I heard a number of things.
No.
Look, not only was Assad, yes,
I heard that McCain was going to give the good rebels arms.
I know.
That never worked out
but
so
look,
well.
right at the very beginning, the Free Syrian Army was being promised by the Obama administration that we are going to help supply you. When that didn't happen, you saw factions and divisions among the ground. People fleeing.
It's a wild place. I mean, let's just face it. Iraq was a wild place. I mean, I remember being there in 2006, and I was like, well, it's not exactly the way I thought it would be. It's a wild place that very few Americans understand. Syria, and Sebastian, you know this, is also, it is incredibly complex. There are so many different ethnic and tribal conflicts, and ISIS offshoots that they fight among each other. They're not even on the same side. And then, of course, Assad with his murderous tactics. Why didn't Germany join us in this effort tonight? The biggest economy in the EU, such a critical ally of the United States, Sebastian. Where was Angela Merkel?
The same Germany that told its ambassador in NATO that he is banned from using the word counterinsurgency when discussing NATO operations in Afghanistan, and it's just a humanitarian operation. That paper tiger. Look, I have to comment on what Sarah says. She's absolutely right in what Jim is saying. Think of one thing. Everybody out there who's got issues, everybody who's got their tinfoil hat on, that the white helmets did it, and that Russia said the British did the chemical attack. I mean, do you want to believe that one next? To anybody who has doubts, think about this one question. What happens when the Assad regime uses chemical weapons, as Secretary Mattis said, and as he did last year, and I saw the intelligence for the proof of that being the Assad regime, and we do nothing? What message does that send to Iran? What message does that send to Assad? What message does that send to proxies? Because it sends a clear message, as far as I'm concerned, that we got away with it and we can do it again. And where are they going to do it next? In Jordan, one of our most important allies in the region, to precipitate a civil war there? Are they going to do it in Tel Aviv? Are we prepared to let that genie out of the bottle? I, as an American, as a taxpayer, as somebody who believes that these kinds of weapons are illegal and should be responded to, I'm not prepared to pay that price.
I understand everything you're saying, Sebastian, but my question is a simple one. We hear a lot about the international community. The international community this, the international community that. We're doing it for international norms. It's the worst thing ever. Of course, it's horrific to use any type of chemical weapon, nerve agent. It's beyond. We can't even comprehend it as Americans. So where's the world community? It's great that we have Britain and France.
Look,
it's fantastic. I love it. But where the heck is the world community?
It doesn't
Japan?
exist.
Where's everybody else?
Without American leadership, there is no action.
Yeah, well, we're out of money. We're out of money. We have no dough. It's not 1995 anymore.
So we don't. So we let children get gassed.
I'm not saying that. But if we have a country that is desperately in debt and getting weaker and weaker and weaker, according to our debt, year after year after year, at some point, somebody's going to have to pay the piper. And so about 2 blocks from here, we got like blocks of people living out on the street. Many of them are American veterans. But what's that got to do with national security?
What does that got to do with moral rectitude?
With moral rectitude is great, but if we are a broke nation, at some point, the American people, forget about what we say on this panel tonight. I'm playing devil's advocate here, because at some point, the American people are going to say, you know something? I'm not voting for this anymore. They're going to elect like Elizabeth Warren.
Fine.
That's what I'm worried about.
That's democracy.
That's what I'm worried about.
President Trump asked for a way out. All right. He said, I want to leave Syria. All right. We gave the plan. to the National Security Council for a way for the regional allies to start taking over that, for Saudi Arabia to pay some of the freight, for the other Gulf nations. They don't have the capability to do this. This is
the capability.
No,
they have big money. What are we talking about?
We've seen enormous strides right now in the relationship between Saudi Arabia and Israel. And I can tell you, talking to sources in Israel, talking to sources in Saudi Arabia, there has been a big difference. And I think that shift is important because what Saudi Arabia is most concerned about is Iran. Yeah. And Saudi Arabia is willing to make amends with Israel to some extent, even offer their airspace.
Well, Jared Kushner,
it's their neighborhood.
Jared Kushner has actually done great work on that and gets no credit.
Right.
He's done great work, which we're going to hear a lot more about in the next coming weeks. McGregor.
Look, I think your viewers should understand that Congress is a rubber stamp. It's not doing its job and hasn't done its job for decades. It's very comfortable sitting there and essentially turning everything over to the president until something really bad happens, at which point in time, of course, they will blame whoever is in the White House. Secondly, again, this is a facade. This is designed to look like something. It's nothing. We haven't changed anything.
What are you talking about? It's designed to, what's designed to look like something?
What we hit on the ground tonight is meaningless. It will
How do you know that?
It will not, because, look, the targets that count were the Russian targets. Without Russia, Assad would not exist. Without Russia, Assad would not have been.
Are you talking about Russian troops, Russian facilities?
Yes, Russian troops, Russian Air Force, Russian air defenses, Russian missiles, Iran as well, Iranian troops. They are the critical factor in the victory in Syria. Now, they are going to divide that country. It's over. We are not going to shape the destiny.
So Russia and Iran are going to divide up Syria,
Russia, Iran,
and we're not going to have anything
Turkey.
to do with it.
But I also think that we were strategic in how we did this, right? Because if we target the Russians on the ground in Syria, if we target Iran specifically, we could end up escalating this to a point we can't return, right?
Right, not be a disaster. But can I make this, Sebastian, last word?
Just listen to what the president said. He said very clearly, we are not there to do some kind of intervention like in the Gulf War back in 2003. We are there to make a stand against one of the most heinous forms of weapons known to man that are illegal. And America as a brand, if we do nothing, then America as a nation starts to lose its meaning for what it represents. I know you believe in what that nation represents. You're a believer. You believe in the eternal values that our founding fathers instilled in our founding documents. If those documents mean anything today, we take this action.
Yeah, I think we could all pull out quotes from the framers about foreign
entanglements. It's not funny, Laura.
I mean,
it's not
funny. But Sebastian, don't get on your moral high horse with me, okay?
No.
Like don't play that game.
But you're making it like a joke.
You're
making it like a joke.
What I'm saying,
it's not a joke.
You're raising the flag of the framers. I can quote an Alexander Hamilton and a George Washington to you tonight, where they're warning us about getting America entangled in foreign affairs over which we can have little effect. I'm not saying, all I'm saying is, I'm not saying it's applicable necessarily here, but we can't, the framers, I mean, it's a complicated situation. Let's now go to Fox News' Jennifer Griffin, who just stepped out of a Pentagon briefing. We brought you at the top of the hour. Jennifer.
Well, Laura, we just heard from Defense Secretary Mattis and General Joe Dunford, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. They were joined by the top representatives of the militaries of France and Britain. They addressed what the targets were that were struck. And we now know that there were 3 targets struck by both manned airplanes as well as Tomahawk and cruise missiles from the Navy. It was in Damascus, the Scientific Research Center, that's an R&D facility of chemical weapons, was struck. And then there was also a chemical weapons storage facility in Homs, that's north of Damascus, and another chemical weapons storage facility near Homs. So those are 3 sites. We were told by the Defense Secretary and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs that this wave of strikes is now over. It is a one-shot message to the Assad regime. It was limited in nature, but Defense Secretary Mattis did say that about twice the amount of munitions were used this year as last year's strike that involved those 59 Tomahawks that struck one site where the Syrian Air Force was based at the time. So this was designed to send a message. They were very careful not to rule out targets where civilians would have been killed. They also obviously were trying not to hit any of the Russian air bases there. General Dunford said that a deconfliction line was used to deconflict the airspace above Syria with the Russians, but targets were not given to the Russians in advance. General Dunford said that the Syrian air defenses, surface-to-air missiles, were engaged in the beginning. Once the U.S. airstrikes began, the U.S. and British and French airstrikes began, but it's not clear whether the Russians actually engaged their air defenses. So they will have more bomb damage assessment tomorrow. Defense Secretary Mattis said that they expected a disinformation campaign from the Syrian regime and its allies. We've seen some of that disinformation in recent days. Defense Secretary Mattis also said that he was convinced yesterday that at least one chemical agent was used in that April 4th attack by the Syrian regime. He said that they are certain that chlorine was used and it is possible, if not probable, that sarin was used. But he said that as of yesterday, he was convinced that at least one chemical agent had been used by the Syrian regime. He was very confident that the Syrian regime was behind that chemical attack on April 4th. Laura?
Jennifer Griffin, thank you so much. And joining us now, Iraq War veteran, I'm delighted he's with us, Chris Nuim. And Waleed Faris, of course, and Don Bramer, former intel officer, Iraq War veteran. Gentlemen, great to see you tonight. We always pray for our troops in harm's way on nights like tonight. And it's a serious time every time we use military force overseas. Waleed, let's get your sense on this. We were talking a little earlier about Syria, like Iraq, extremely complicated place. I think we in America, we think of the Middle East all as one place.
That's right.
And it's the exact opposite of that. It's like 100 places. Tell us about Syria on the ground and your view of what happened tonight.
What happened tonight, Laura, what I know, I can see is that this is not a U.S.-Syria operation. This is not the invasion of Iraq. This is not the invasion of Afghanistan. For those who are debating and getting very warm about this issue, this is a very specific strike against the Assad regime capacities to deliver chemical weapons. Now, we cannot judge tonight. If the Syrian regime decides to stop using it, operation is over. If there are reactions, which I anticipate not necessarily in Damascus, but other parts of Syria where we have assets, it's a different story.
Don?
I would have to agree. And, you know, we did 3 precision attacks with facilities that are sarin gas, which has a very high density and a very low burn-off rate. So I think if Assad and his folks act out and they take this as the message it was meant to be, then this could resolve itself rather quick. Optimistically, I don't think so. I think that Assad will react, and then we'll see what happens tomorrow morning.
Chris, as former intel officer, you're so young, how can you be a former intel officer? But, you know, apparently we hit a number of storage facilities. My question is, if we knew the storage facilities, this might be a really dumb question, but if you know the storage facilities are there, and we thought, well, they had destroyed the weapons previously, we launched our strikes against the airfield last year, why didn't we do a preemptive strike? Why did we wait until they used the weapons and 40 people were killed and more badly injured apparently tonight still in hospitals?
That's a great question, Larry. It was former military police. Don's the intel guy, but close enough. I learned a lot from being around him. But I think that we looked at the multilateral approach and the due diligence of having those walk-ups and the intel gathering and having all those allies. We've looked at this for a few days. We know what this is, and they've had plenty of opportunities. So right now, the quantity of the strike has increased, so we're hitting those facilities designed to prevent those aerial ships from doing this again and those planes from launching. So we're trying to hit him hard enough where he stops doing this.
Do we think that Europe is really